Well, it seemed logical to start about 1066. It's as good a place as any. Why 1066? Why not? It was my first lesson, so it was particularly fixed in my memory. As the Chinese, I believe, are supposed to have said, the longest journey begins with a single stride. So if I'm going to tackle the whole of English history, really doesn't matter where I start. And another advantage that 1066 and Hastings has is, of course, everybody knows something about it. Or at least they think they know something about it. Another problem, too, is the further back you contemplate a historical event, the more difficult it becomes. If I can take an illustration from art, perspective, if you drew a picture of a wooden fence, the first fence paling that you look at is quite wide. The second one is a bit narrower. The third one is narrower still. And so, as you know, that goes on until there are no lines of the palings at all. It's just one mishmash of colour. And the same thing applies when you look back to events in history. This foreshortening takes place. You have to telescope periods more and more and more until in the end you finish up with a sort of general impression. And this is what often happens with primary school projects. If Miss decided to do a project, say, on medieval monastery, she doesn't go into the details of the Benedictine rule. She doesn't go into the details of how you organise a monastic day. The children just did a project on what it was like to be a medieval monk. So we have pictures of monks' habits. We have a picture of a monastery. We have a picture of the writing room. No actual events. So it becomes merely impressionistic. If you want to find out something more, you've got to read something more. Very little real detail. So the same thing applies to Normandy. If you think you know something about the Norman conquest, well, let's try one or two things. Can you name 2 rivers in Normandy? Can you name 2 seaports in Normandy? Can you name a cathedral city in Normandy? There are half a dozen of them. Can you even tell us why Normandy was called Normandy? The minute you're told, of course, you say, yes, that's obvious. What had happened in the 8th and 9th century, Vikings had travelled everywhere, as you know, causing mayhem and destruction all over the place. And they were known, obviously, as the Northmen, because they had come from the north. Some of them settled in the north of France. The King of France was at his wit's end to know what to do with these Norman raiders, until in the end he thought, right, well, if they've come here to look for land and to seize it, let's give them some. And that might stop the other raids coming. By and large, it worked. So they settled in northern France. So the Northmen settled in what became known as Normandy. Normandy became Normandy. So that's where Normandy comes from. But to carry on the questionnaire, apart from 1066, can you name another single date in Norman history? Take William. What do you know about William the Conqueror? All right, so he was called William the Conqueror, but he was 38 years old when he conquered England. Do you know anything about William before he was 38 years old? I bet you don't. Oh, yes, you might know one thing. You will know that he was called William the Bastard. Why? Obviously, because his father had neglected to marry his mother. We know his mother's name, Arlette. She lived in a Norman town called Falaise. If you go to Falaise today, you will see a castle, and they will tell you that it is the castle of Duke Robert of Normandy. It wasn't actually, it was built sometime later, but never mind. That's what the legend is for the tourists. And the story goes that Robert looked out of the window of his castle one day, and down by the stream there were some young women of the town doing the family laundry. And he rather liked the look of one of them. And as Norman barons and Norman lords were accustomed to doing, he sent word down that this particular one, Arlette, was to be brought up to the castle. Later on, he didn't marry her, but he took her as his life's partner, and she became the mother of William. So that's the legend. As I say, they'll even show you the window in Falaise Castle out of which Robert looked when he caught sight of Arlette. But it's a different castle, I'm afraid. Anyway, William came to the throne very young because his father had gone on a pilgrimage, got ill, died, so didn't come back, and William found himself in charge of a duchy at the age of 7 or 8. You can imagine what happened. His rule in Normandy was beset by other barons, nobles, foreigners, the King of France, pretty well anybody who fancied his chances of seizing a bit of extra territory. And William was very fortunate in having 2 or 3 guardians who looked after him very faithfully. In fact, 2 died in their duty of looking after William. So he grew up in a very, very stern set of circumstances. On at least 2 occasions, he was yanked out of bed in the middle of the night because assassins were actually in the castle with the daggers out, trying to kill him. You can imagine what a life like this must have done to a growing boy. So he grew up very hard indeed. He learned soldiering very early. He was commanding men in battle when he was 15 years old. So by the time he got to 38, there wasn't very much you could tell William about running a duchy in medieval France. He was a very successful one too. He had plenty of enemies, particularly the King of France himself. This was the man who, at the age of 38, had embarked on the conquest of England. Why? Well, we'll come to that a little bit later on.